Just imagine, if you were born into a Dalit family in India, what would your life be like? Your name holds but one meaning: filth. You were born with no land, no access to school, and even a simple egg was a luxury. You're only fit for a lifetime of cleaning up shit. You have faith in the divine, yet you cannot set foot in a church. When a person dies, they don't even have a single inch of land to be buried in. Even worth an animal. Millions of Indians face this reality every day. It has existed for thousands of years and remains unchanged to this very day. What created such a rigid caste system in India? Can Buddhism help the marginalized in this society liberate themselves from suffering and find salvation for their souls? And is it possible to eradicate Brahmanism from this society? Let's explore together in today. Brahmanism is one of the oldest religions of India, and has profoundly impacted the structure of Indian society for centuries, an influence that persists to this very day. Accordingly, ancient Indian society was divided into four main castes. At the highest level are the Brahmins. They were the clergy who held the highest position in society, and were also the only ones entitled to perform rituals worshipping God and the deities. Second is the class of scholar aristocrats. They were nobles and warriors who held the power to govern and to reward or punish the people. Third is the Vaishya caste. They include artisans, farmers, merchants, and traders, buying, selling, and conducting business with all levels of society. Wednesday is the Shudra caste, which includes slaves and the poorest laborers in society. Additionally, there exists another class that does not belong to this caste system. They were the outcasts, also known as the untouchables, for they were considered to be utterly impure. Just touching them is enough to make a person unclean. The nascent origins of this aberrant division appeared in the Vedas and were later explicitly codified in the Manusmriti as follows. Now, for the purpose of protecting all sentient beings, Brahma will assign tasks to people at each different level. Brahmins, born from the mouth of Brahma, have the duty to study, teach, and perform sacrificial rites. Kshatriyas, those born from the arms of Brahma, have the duty to protect the nation and its people. Vej, those born from the thigh of Brahma, have the duty to create material wealth. The Shudras, the class said to be born from the feet of Brahma, have the duty to serve the upper classes. Thus, of the four great hells, Katu Maharajika, the Sanjiva hell is the lowest level. However, compared to the fate of the lowly, they were still considered somewhat more fortunate. At the very least, they were still acknowledged as human beings. Meanwhile, the status of the lowborn was even lower than that of livestock. And this mistaken division will be passed down from one generation to the next, from the previous generation to the next, becoming a lifelong fate that cannot be changed. Untouchable. According to ancient beliefs, there are three things that can cause a person to lose consciousness. One is when humans go through particular life stages, such as childbirth, the moment of death, or during a woman's menstrual cycle. Second, contact with contaminated objects, such as animal carcasses. And third is getting to know new people. However, the unconsciousness of the Indian untouchables was not caused by three genes, but by a genetic inheritance from their parents. Regardless of their parents' social class, children are classified into that same class and must carry it with them for life, with no possibility of change. When referring to the inadequacy of this oppressive caste hierarchy system, Dr. Ambedkar, in one of his works, he wrote that humans are born unconsciously, live in delusion, and when they die, they depart this life in obscurity. When they have children, the child also inherits that ignorance like a permanent imprint, impossible to erase. According to 1908 statistics, India had as many as 50 million people belonging to the untouchable caste, a figure that accounted for 16% of the country's total population. To date, this figure has not seen significant change. To better visualize the reality of the underclass, the following section will provide an in-depth analysis of several specific aspects. From a societal perspective, according to the provisions of the Manusmriti, the Shudra caste was not permitted to live within the village and was compelled to reside outside the area inhabited by the other castes. Their meals had to be served on broken plates. The clothes they wore were sewn from the burial shrouds of the dead, and their jewelry was merely fragments of tattered books. They were not allowed to wear silk, shoes, watches, or any kind of silver jewelry, as a way to distinguish them from others. This discrimination was also clearly evident in the practice of naming. Individuals from the Shudra and Dalit castes were forbidden from having beautiful names and were instead forced to bear names that conveyed inferiority and contempt. Typically, they take the names of birds and animals as their own. Naturally, they are absolutely forbidden from eating or marrying those of the upper class. Their lives hold no value whatsoever, and those of the upper classes could take their lives without facing any compensation. The Shudras and the untouchables were not permitted to bathe or draw water from public water sources, because doing so would pollute the water sources. They are forced to live segregated from the community, in extremely filthy and unsanitary places. They were not permitted to enter the village, unless summoned by someone of a different class for a task, such as collecting excrement, disposing of dead animal carcasses, or delivering news of a funeral or wedding. Abolish the class system. Members of the untouchable class were not permitted to approach other social classes, as it was feared that even their shadow would pollute those of a higher caste. On the road, the lowly commoners were forced to carry brooms to sweep away their own footprints, fearing that if others stepped on them, they would be defiled and contaminated. Economically, the underclass was denied the right to own land, for if they possessed property, they would potentially gain independence and no longer be subservient to the ruling class. In the village, the upper class, such as the Lamun ladies and the Kshatriyas, monopolized all key positions in the economic and political machinery, leaving the lower classes with no opportunity to advance. Because the law doesn't. In such destitute circumstances, how did these outcasts survive? They had no choice but to labor for the ruling class, and the upper echelons, fully aware of this vulnerability, exploited their labor to the utmost. Here, the price is entirely set by the landlord. There is no room for negotiation. They pay as they please, sometimes in cash, other times in crops like corn or rice depending on the season. If it were money, it would only be small change, and if it were rice, it would all be moldy grains mixed with animal dung. When the harvest season ended, these poor villagers would go to cut grass or gather firewood to sell at the market. Here, just as when working as hired laborers for landowners, they again face collusion between the employers and the upper class to drive down the value of their labor to the lowest possible level. Additionally, ordinary people could also make a living through jobs such as street sweeping, sanitation work, pulling sedan chairs, and begging. In the past, education was reserved exclusively for the aristocracy. For those from the lower echelons of society, attending school was not only unacceptable but was even considered a sin. If anyone overhears the Vedic hymns, molten lead shall be poured into their ears. If anyone recites those verses without authorization, their tongue shall be cut out. If they study the Vedas, they will be torn into fragments. For the Brahmins believe the Vedas are the language of God, accessible only to the noble. The vile creature who dares to lay hands upon the sacred texts defiles the holy scriptures, and in doing so, commits blasphemy against God. But perhaps there is another aesthetic and epistemological reason why the Brahmins forbade others from accessing the Vedic system. Because both the Vedas themselves and the Sanskrit language used to record them are the very source of knowledge. Much like Latin in medieval and Renaissance Europe, or the 4 books and 5 classics of Confucianism. Although both the 4 great temples and the Tien Shan region worship the same belief system, each place venerates different deities. But between them lay a vast chasm, as wide as that between heaven and the abyss. The lowly could never set foot in the temples of the noble. If they wished to worship the deities, they had to perform the rites from a distance. However, they typically have their own smaller temples, and upon death, they also have their own separate crematoriums. Mrs. Lam on Sao not only held misguided views about social status, but also exhibited profoundly deep-seated gender biases. It must be acknowledged that in most ancient and medieval societies, the role of women was extremely minor, and could even be described as pitiable. It goes without saying that ancient kings and emperors maintained vast harems, while common men taking multiple wives and concubines was also considered perfectly normal. Poor parents could sell their daughters, and husbands could buy, sell, exchange, or even offer their wives as gifts to others as if they were property. According to the Manu Code of the Indians, a woman, regardless of her age, is never permitted to decide or act according to her own will. To be under the guidance and management of men, from fathers, uncles, brothers, and sons to the most important one, a husband. Even if the husband is of poor character or afflicted by grave illnesses, the wife must still wholeheartedly revere and worship him as she would a saint. If the wife does not obey the law, she will be severely punished, for example, by being torn apart by horses. Moreover, women in ancient India were not permitted to practice religious rites or pursue a spiritual life of their own. The perfect wife. Furthermore, women often possess many flaws, making it difficult for them to achieve diligence in spiritual practice and to comprehend profound doctrines. Listening to and reciting the Sanskrit scripture is not appropriate. Furthermore, since one cannot recite it alone, a woman cannot use this method for self-purification. Therefore, women must bear that sin throughout their entire lives. It is precisely because of these three characteristics, namely, unpredictability, sinfulness, and the inability to chant the scriptures, that they must suffer thus. In summary, within the Indian social class system of that time, the Shudra caste and those belonging to the untouchable class were the groups that suffered the greatest disadvantages and injustices. They were not only deprived of all rights, but were even treated worse than animals. Tan Gondoe described their situation, stating that socially, they were treated like lepers. Economically, they were worse off than slaves. Religiously, they were outcasts, barred from entering the so-called houses of God. Although they also practice Hinduism, those belonging to the Dalit caste are forbidden from using public utilities such as roads, schools, hospitals, water sources, and parks. Sangharakshita, a European monk who played a major role in reviving Buddhism in India, once described that there were approximately 100 million untouchables in the country. Each day, approximately 400 to 500 of them are killed by the high-ranking commanders, while thousands of others endure beatings, rape, and terror through acts of looting and house burning. The number of times they have faced discrimination, harassment, and humiliation is beyond counting. Such incidents occur almost daily. This distorted caste division makes Indian society resemble a multi-compartment box, where each caste is a separate compartment with a completely distinct way of life. Ambedkar also asserted that India would be unable to progress and develop without abolishing the caste system. You cannot build a country, a moral system, or anything on a foundation that is flawed from the very beginning. A single wrong note can ruin everything, and as long as there are wrong notes, don't expect to achieve perfection. This very caste discrimination was the reason Buddhism gradually weakened and ultimately vanished completely from India. We all know very well that Buddhism never acknowledges the caste system. The Buddha pointed out that even women of the Brahmin caste menstruate, become pregnant, and breastfeed, no differently than women of other castes. Children of the Brahmin caste are born no different from the children of any other social class. Moreover, the Brahmins could not escape the cycle of birth, old age, sickness, and death. Their blood was just as red and their tears just as bitterly salty as anyone else's. A Brahmin, even if they break the law, cannot escape the punishment of the law. More broadly, they cannot escape the law of karmic cause and effect, just like anyone else. Similarly, on the path to liberation, if a Brahmin is not diligent and does not ardently practice meditation, they will still be subject to rebirth within the 6 realms. And if they devote themselves to spiritual practice, they too will attain liberation like anyone else. Therefore, in terms of human nature, there is no inherent difference between a Brahmin and members of other social classes. That perspective of the Buddhas incited the hatred of the Brahmanical religion. Buddhism advocated for class equality, which threatened the privileged status of the Brahmin caste. It also opposed animal sacrifice, causing the priests who specialized in performing these rituals to lose a major source of income. Indians had a customary practice of inviting priests to perform rituals for the village or household deities. However, under the influence of Buddhism, they gradually lost faith in this tradition and ceased summoning priests for ceremonies. Therefore, the ascetics, having lost a major source of profit, allied with the ruling authorities to oppose Buddhism. Particularly, when Buddhism nearly became the state religion under Emperor Ashoka, which equated to a threat to their own existence, the Brahmin priests and their followers naturally could not stand idly by. Therefore, they launched a movement against Buddhism in various forms. On one hand, they sowed seeds of prejudice and discrimination against monks, for instance by spreading propaganda that encountering a monk would bring bad luck. On the other hand, they also assimilated Buddhism into their own religion, for instance by propagating that the Buddha was the 9th incarnation of the god Vishnu, and that Buddhism was merely a branch of Brahmanism. The decline of Buddhism in India. The Brahmins assimilated the Buddha's teachings into their own religious system, blurring the lines between Buddhism and Brahmanism and making them difficult to distinguish. This is a historical fact, and it was this very phenomenon that profoundly impacted and led to the decline of Buddhism in India. Alongside Brahmin priests and scholars attacking Buddhism on the ideological front, Brahmin-aligned kings also used violence to suppress the religion founded by the Buddha. King Bhumitra Amisha, the dynasty's founding monarch, restored the status of Brahmanism after his coronation, reversing its decline from the dominant position it had lost during the reign of King Ashoka. On one hand, the king restored animal sacrifice rituals. On the other hand, he vigorously suppressed Buddhism by destroying pagodas, temples, and towers, and slaughtering monks. During this period, Buddhism not only lost the royal patronage it had previously enjoyed, but the religion itself was also severely damaged. King Shashanka was a pivotal historical figure who founded and became the first ruler of the Gauda kingdom. His reign is generally dated by scholars to the 7th century CE, a highly influential period in Indian history. Shashanka was renowned as a devout Hindu and a formidable adversary of Buddhism. His rule marked an era of prosperity and significant territorial expansion for the kingdom, while also being defined by conflicts with neighboring powers, particularly the Harsha kingdom. Although records of his life and reign are sparse and fragmentary, King Shashanka's legacy remains a significant and enduring subject of study for historians. Born in 603 and dying in 620, this king enacted even more severe measures to suppress Buddhism. According to the records of Xuanzang, in addition to destroying temples, King Shashanka also threw the stone slab bearing the footprint of the Buddha into the Ganges River. At the Bodhi monastery, the Bodhi tree was cut down and the Buddha statue was replaced with a statue of the god Vishnu. If the waning influence of the Lamun sect weakened Indian Buddhism, then the Muslim invasions were the very cause that completely eradicated this religion from its very birthplace. Arab Muslims began invading India in the 7th century, followed by Turkish-origin Muslim invasions in the 9th century. To facilitate the establishment of their faith, Muslims strongly suppressed indigenous religions. Who destroyed the Nalanda University? The survivors sought to flee to neighboring countries such as China, Nepal, and Tibet. While millions of followers were forcibly converted to Islam, following historical upheavals, other religions were easily restored and able to develop once again. However, Buddhism in India has yet to show signs of revival. What is the reason for this? This stems from the fact that caste discrimination has been deeply ingrained in Indian society for thousands of years. And the only way for the oppressed to escape the tragedy of their lives is to rise up and restore the Buddhist teachings right upon the very land where the Buddha discovered the path to liberation from suffering. Fully aware of this, an exceptional leader emerged. That is Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar, born on April 14, 1891, who came from a family belonging to the Dalit caste. Influenced by Western democracies, B.R. Ambedkar rose up to fight against the entire caste system in Indian society. As a true Buddhist, he steadfastly followed the path of the Buddha, the path of liberation that is open to all, eradicating all bondage and caste distinctions, and all other forms of discrimination. The Buddha himself regarded caste distinctions in society as nothing more than a product of culture, ideology, and belief. The Buddha liberated humanity from all dogmatic and artificial systems, while elevating the status of women to be equal to that of men. He views all sentient beings as spiritually equal, each possessing the same right to the path of enlightenment. The Sangha is a form of democracy, welcoming all strata of society. B.O. Amprika believed that the Buddhist doctrine was a long-term path to liberation, but it also needed to be oriented toward implementing social reforms. In his view, Buddhism is not merely a religion but also a profound philosophical system of ethics. It was this very philosophy that provided him with a life ideal, compelling him to dedicate himself to social service activities. This ethical ideal harmoniously blends individuality and collectivism, exerting a direct and profound impact on social life. Therefore, he often expressed his hope that Buddhism would help people achieve the moral ideals he himself cherished. He advised the humble, ordinary people to return to Buddhism, as it is the path to their own liberation. October 14, 1956, was a significant milestone when as many as 380,000 laypeople participated in a mass initiation ceremony. Indeed, it was a historic day, marking the revival of Buddhism in the land of India. The mass conversion movement of Dalits continues to spread from one state to another, but is simultaneously met with countless significant obstacles. Currently, The most pressing obstacles are the lack of a sufficiently capable monastic community to provide guidance and the absence of a place for practice. The common people, already impoverished, lacked guidance and the necessary means to participate in communal activities. Another recent leader is Osirai, who was a high-ranking official in the government. But he resigned and established a political party named the Justice Party. He was officially ordained into Buddhism on November 4, 2001 and has since made continuous efforts to help those in difficult circumstances. Encourage them to return to Buddhism and organize dedicated meditation retreats for them. In a society still rife with so many injustices, it is highly likely that larger-scale movements will emerge in the future to restore Buddhism in India. And that is the only and shortest path to achieving social justice. Thank you for watching the video until the end. See you in the next videos, everyone.